Price Presents is the USC Price School's premier webinar series about issues confronting society that shape our daily lives. Each webinar features experts not only from the Price School, but across USC, as well as from other universities, government, business, and not-for-profits. Today's discussion, titled Fixing the Border, Immigration Policy Solutions, will be moderated by USC professor at the Price School of Public Policy and the Annenberg School for Communication and Journalism, Roberto Suro. Though the audience will not be able to ask questions verbally, we encourage you to submit your questions in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and the panelists will respond to as many as possible. Now, I'd like to turn the presentation over to Professor Suro.
Yes, good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining us. I'm going to start out by just a very brief introduction to our topic, and then turn to the panelists, and I will introduce them each in turn as I ask them the first round of questions. And then we'll go from there with a discussion and your questions as well. If you want detailed biographies of our panelists, they're available in chat and on the webpage where you signed up for this. So just to begin, a few facts that we want to stipulate too. The foreign-born population in this country has doubled over the past 30 years. Meanwhile, the nation's GDP has doubled as well. With a total that will soon top 50 million, the foreign-born are about 14% of the total population, approaching a historic high. About 80% of the foreign-born are lawful immigrants. The number of naturalized citizens is more than double the number of unauthorized immigrants. Estimates of the number of unauthorized immigrants have remained steady between 10 and 11 million for nearly 20 years, with the last substantial increase taking place before the Great Recession. Our focus today is on a newer kind of migration. Over the past decade or so, the United States and Western Europe have become destinations for people displaced by violence and poverty in fragile states, movements that often occur in surges, often abetted by social media and criminal smuggling organizations, and that cover long travel routes that pass through countries of transit. Flows that typically include women and children, and that are often moving towards well-established diaspora communities of co-nationals, often family members. In most perplexing in policy terms, these migrants do not seek to evade immigration authorities, rather their goal is to apply for asylum. And as a matter of law, in all of the rich democracies, a migrant has a right to seek asylum no matter how they enter the country. The asylum stream has increased roughly five-fold in the past decade, as measured by the number of asylum applications received each year. Though the right to seek asylum is clear and codified, the policies and processes for administering that right are dysfunctional and inconsistent. Consider that all the destination states have tried through proxies and force to block migrants from their borders, but despite the suffering and death inflicted, those policies have failed. Presidents and prime ministers have come and gone, but no lasting solutions have emerged to the challenges of adjudicating asylum claims, settling those admitted, and removing those rejected. Nonetheless, large displacement migrations are likely to continue for decades to come, given a combination of megatrends, including the disproportionate impact of climate change on poor societies and the demographic decline of rich states. Given all that, what policy agendas will lead to lasting solutions? Well, this panel is just a group of people to help us find answers. I'm going to start, as I said, with a round of questions to each of the panelists in turn. I'm going to start with Erika Pinheiro, the executive director of Otro, Lado, a binational nonprofit organization that provides legal and humanitarian services on the US-Mexico border. Erika, let's assume that anyone who wants to seek asylum in the United States is able to arrive and make that claim to a US official. How do we imagine the process for adjudicating those claims and in a fair and humane, orderly way is the sort of terminology we normally adopt? how does the government process so many people seeking entry in that form?
Well, first, thank you so much for having me today. I'm really looking forward to this discussion. I just wanted to comment on the first part of your question, which is assuming that individuals can present themselves to U.S. authorities to seek asylum. And that, unfortunately, has not been the case for a very long time. Since 2016, the U.S. government has been turning asylum seekers away from ports of entry, really forcing them to cross between ports. And that is the reason underlying a lot of the chaos that you see on the border of people who are crossing unlawfully. They're referred to as invaders by individuals who want to gain political leverage from the situation. But I think that's the first issue that we really need to deal with, is making sure that people can actually access a U.S. official, can get onto U.S. soil in a safe, orderly, and humane way. And that is what U.S. law requires. U.S. law says that Customs and Border Protection cannot turn asylum seekers away. And we've been litigating this issue since 2017, won in the courts. Unfortunately, the government has still not adhered to the law. And so, if they did adhere to the law, I think that we would have a much more orderly process. The amount of resources that are dedicated to processing people who cross between ports of entry could be reallocated toward asylum screenings. But I think another problem that we need to consider is the fact that due to a lack of other types of avenues toward legalization, there are, in fact, individuals who arrive at the border and use the asylum system when they might be economic migrants. And it's hard to tell what that percentage is, but we do know that when the H-2A system was expanded for Mexicans, for example, we saw a huge drop in the number of people crossing unlawfully or heading into the asylum system, in an attempt to reach their family members in the United States. So I think it's hard to imagine how we would fix this problem if the U.S. government continues to allocate the majority of their resources toward deterrence, toward turnbacks, and toward really, imprisoning a population, especially those who are legitimate asylum seekers, imprisoning them and treating them in a way that isn't consistent with their vulnerabilities. It's not consistent with the law, and it doesn't lend itself to a fair adjudication of asylum claims. So you can imagine someone who's detained cannot get, evidence to support their asylum claim, doesn't speak the language to submit everything in English. It just doesn't work, to get a fair adjudication of that claim. So I think that there's a lot of issues that need to be addressed before we can get there, but for sure, reallocating resources away from prevention through deterrence and away from turnbacks toward adjudications would be a great first step.
Okay. We turn to Carlos Heredia, who is a professor at CIDE, the Centro de Investigación y Docencias Económicas, which is a public research center specializing in the social sciences in Mexico City. Carlos, one of the things that's become apparent here and when you look at Western Europe as well is that the management of this kind of migration increasingly involves transit states. It's more than just a question of individuals leaving one place and going to another in a straight line. In that people pause, people seek sometimes legal status in transit states, they move on. It's become a complex relationship, and no more complex than the relationship between the United States and Mexico in managing migration. So let me ask you, what does the policy agenda look like when we think of this in international terms, particularly when we think about a neighboring state like Mexico that is serving as the transit point for so many people coming to the United States?
Okay, well, I also want to take advantage of this first few seconds to thank USC Price for the invitation, especially to Dr. Suro. And I'm happy to share the panel with so many friends and distinguished speakers. First of all, I would say that there is not a definite, a very clearly defined policy by the government of Mexico to deal with Mexico being a transit country. I would say, Roberto, that over the last few years, what has taken place is that the government has adapted its policies in response to varying political conditions. And the first move to adapt its policies happened 6 months into the López Obrador administration in June 2019, when the US government, namely Donald Trump, said, either you crack down on migrants or I will impose tariffs on you. And that's what happened. The government started with giving humanitarian visas to migrants, and then it ended up any possibility of granting crossing permits or visas to people who were in transit to the United States. And ever since, what we have seen is an increasing militarization of the US-Mexico border and the Mexican government responding to pressures from the United States governments, both the Trump administration and the Biden administration, to do the dirty work, let's name it that way, of immigration containment, detention, and deportation. Now, is it in the interest of Mexico to defend its own border? Of course. But the complicated situation here is that an increasing number of other than Mexicans are coming to Mexico en route to the United States, and then they are tentatively deported by the United States to Mexico, even though they may be Guatemalans, Honduras, Salvadorians, Venezuelans, Nicaraguan, Cubans, and so on. So that is a very excruciating situation because no country ever has formally accepted for an indefinite period of time to host non-nationals under its responsibility for an indefinite period of time. It is said that, and it was said in Remain in Mexico, that it would be for a short period of time while the claims to seek asylum in the United States were resolved by the courts. But it was only a very small number that found a quick, definite answer in the US courts. So that extended for a long period of time. What I would like to say, in the case, at least in the case of Mexican migrants, is that a key point in time in when we lost circularity in migration, that was prior to 9/11. Circularity in migration meant that we were not talking about permanent, definite migration, but about people moving on a seasonal basis or for a definite period of time and keeping their home address as their permanent residence and then going back when needed. Because when you close the door to deter entries, you also close the door to deter exits. So the policy became the making of a crisis because a number of people who were already inside the United States decided they would not even attempt to go back to Mexico, but stay there because they were not certain they could enter the United States when hired again. So that's to begin with policies that would lead to some kind of different approach or solution. I would mention that.
Okay, thank you. Well, we'll come back to all of these points in a moment. Let me turn now, though, to Theresa Cardinal Brown, Senior Advisor on Immigration and Border Policy at the Bipartisan Policy Center in Washington, D.C., a think tank and advisory policy studies group. Theresa, Erika mentioned that some number of asylum seekers or probably could be economic migrants. Raises the question, are there other ways, other pathways aside from asylum that could logically be part of addressing displacement migrations?
Well, thank you again, Roberto. Thank you to the Price School for inviting me. I think that's a very good question. And I think we've seen different administrations over the last 10 years try to address this in different ways. It bears stating up front that expansion of our legal immigration system is limited by our laws. Our legal immigration system, particularly for workers, is set in statute. The categories can't be adjusted. Where there are caps, they can't really be adjusted, but by a subsequent legislation. And Congress has been unable to pass any changes to those laws in more than 30 years. So what we've seen is attempts by particularly the Biden administration to see if they could use existing means in the law to encourage migrants to pursue other avenues to enter the United States rather than arriving and asking for asylum. These include trying to expand, Erika mentioned the H-2A program, which is a temporary worker program for agriculture, people who work literally in agriculture, mostly in the fields. That is an uncapped program, but traditionally has been upwards of 80% of migrants in that program came from Mexico. And the administration is trying to see if they can encourage employers in the United States to recruit from Central America, which is a large number of the more recent arrivals, and working with governments in Central America to identify potential workers. That's a relatively small program. It's a few thousand right now, but they're trying to grow it so that that can be an alternative avenue. You have the H-2B program, which is for temporary seasonal work that's not in agriculture, but that program is capped at 66,000 a year. But Congress has allowed the Department of Homeland Security to grant additional visas on top of that cap over the last several years. And what the administration has done is designate a certain number of those visas only for nationals from certain countries, particularly those countries that are heavily migrating to the border right now in Central America. Then you see interesting and pretty much new uses of expansive of the president's parole authority. So parole is an authority under immigration law that says if you otherwise would not have a visa to come into the United States, but there is an interest of the United States in having you enter, we can grant you parole, which is a temporary admission for a certain period of time. It can grant work authorization depending on how you obtain that parole. What the administration has done, though, is use it in limited ways to address nationals from countries that we have a difficult time sending people back to, namely Cuba and Venezuela, and Nicaragua, and also Haiti, although we have been sending people back to all of those countries in greater or lesser amounts. But the significant increase in the number of those arrivals, and for a long time, those were nationalities that Mexico would not allow us to send back to Mexico, and we could not deport them. So they became part of the millions of migrants in the United States trying to figure out how to navigate our asylum system. So these are potentially alternative avenues. This Cuban, Haitian, Nicaragua, and Venezuelan parole program has been quite successful, at least as it relates to Cubans and Nicaraguans, and that the number of people going between ports of entry has gone down, and that we've seen pretty significant usage of those parole programs for those nationals. But they're limited. Those are 30,000 a month total. And that is partially because in negotiations with Mexico, Mexico would agree to take back an equal number of people who were not eligible to apply when they arrived at the border. So, we're still doing this sort of carrot and stick thing. And it's still, I think we're looking at, last year it was more than 2.5 million. We're probably going to see 3 million encounters at the border. These programs are not large enough, and nor are they well known enough beyond the border to encourage people to apply through different means. For many, many decades, the United States has had very limited refugee resettlement capacity in the Western Hemisphere. And as a matter of law, someone who's granted asylum has to meet the exact same standards as someone who qualifies as a refugee. The only difference is that a refugee is adjudicated outside the United States and then with governmental support resettled to the United States. So that would be the obvious alternative for those that do have true protection claims, but we don't have capacity in the hemisphere. And there are a lot of reasons for that. One of which is that many countries in the hemisphere are not eager, as Carlos kind of noted, to host large numbers of foreign nationals in their territory for an indefinite period of time while refugee resettlement is adjudicated by the United States or any number of countries. But I think it's worth understanding that, we need to think of alternative means. What has happened now, I think, and because it's been building for a decade, is that many, many migrants, not just in the Western Hemisphere, but around the world, now believe that the only chance they have of ever coming to the United States is to get to the border and ask for asylum, that they don't know that or believe that there are other avenues that might be available to them. And this migration is being encouraged by criminal smuggling networks that are now integrated into transnational criminal organizations and have a money-making interest in facilitating that belief and encouraging unlawful migration. So governments such as the United States, and I think other governments that are dealing with this in other places of the world, have a big uphill battle to counter that, provide alternative avenues, and make those avenues very well known and in the potentially migrating communities, and try to redirect as much of this as possible.
Next in our fourth and panelist, Alexandra Délano Alonso, who's a professor of global studies at the New School, a university in New York City. Alexandra, let's take a step back from policy and think this in sort of broader cultural, political terms. So in the United States, the notion that we're a nation of immigrants gets kicked around a lot, and it means a lot of different things to different people. You recently wrote that we need new narratives, and I think the words you used were larger stories to understand and evaluate immigration policies and what immigration means to us as a nation. So tell us what needs to be included in those larger stories to help us try to make sense of what is this very complicated picture that's developed from our remarks already.
Thank you so much, and it's an honor to be here with this panel and with you all. So let me take a step back from the nation of immigrants for a moment, and just to establish how much narratives and the language around immigration has mattered so much in shaping public opinion and therefore policy responses. So nowadays, the common framing that we hear in the US and globally is mostly about this crisis or this migrant or migration crisis, which very much takes us away from a framing or an analysis that focuses on a crisis of a broader system, the immigration system, or if we want to go further, an economic and political system or systems that underlie the causes for migration, as well as the conditions in which people move and arrive, as was just explained. The idea of a crisis, a migration crisis, frames it as something that is beyond the government's or society's capacity to respond, that it requires an emergency or an exceptional measure, that it's straining the systems to a degree that's detrimental mainly to citizens that are already there, and therefore creates these categories of who deserves or who doesn't deserve government support and resources, and establishes a framework in which measures such as more deployment of the military or the police, or building fences or inhumane treatment of people is justified under such an umbrella. This umbrella also blames the issue on the people that move. It focuses merely on the fact of people moving rather than on the broader causes of this migration that can be both exceptional conditions such as war, conflict, or a natural event, or longer-term issues like now climate change, but also from the earlier, poverty and unemployment that we continue to see. And all of those causes is what we're seeing together now. And obviously, we have lived through, in the Mexico-US case since NAFTA 30 years ago, 30 years of proposals for comprehensive immigration reform and what that might mean, including solutions for different legal pathways, reforming asylum system, addressing root causes, putting resources towards integration instead of security measures, And none of those proposals have ever been enough, to make a change. None of those changes have been made. And so that for me leads to this idea of like, then what will create that change? Because it's not just about the political will or which party is in power. We've seen many parties in power in both Mexico and the US doing exactly the same thing, if not more of the same. So where can that change come from, and what is the role of narrative in this change? And so the idea of the welcoming nation of immigrants is clearly not an accurate reflection of the reality today, but it's not an accurate reflection of the history of the US, at least not completely. There is a part of this welcoming and a place that people want to come to because of what's available there in terms of opportunity. But the nation of immigrants invisibilizes histories of racism and discrimination against indigenous peoples and people who came to the country as slaves, that if we come to an understanding of those as part of the structural issues that create not just causes for people to migrate, but the conditions in which they arrive, the exclusions that they face, the anti-immigrant sentiment that creates these negative perceptions, and therefore the lack of political will to respond to these populations, I think that allows for a much broader understanding of what is happening, what is at stake, and what it would require for people, the common day narrative, to change in terms of why people are moving and what are the challenges that they face, and also what a response to those challenges could mean, not just for migrants, but for citizens as well. So these larger stories are hopefully stories that can move people to understand the structural issues, the legacies of colonialism, slavery, discrimination, racism that underlie these conditions that force people to move, but that also affect their lives when they arrive to the country, when they settle, and also maybe people that return to their countries of origin, right? Those larger stories are about migration as a full process, not just immigration, but emigration, transit migration, return and deportation. That is part of what we're talking about. And also how we can think about these questions, not just as a policy level, but in the day-to-day, how these are structural issues that are affecting all of us, migrants and citizens in both countries or globally, and the idea that our well-being is tied to each other beyond these constructed boundaries of citizenship. Larger stories that can think not just along frameworks of integration, but what constitutes well-being for everyone and access to opportunity, how we can think beyond logics of security that criminalize people and that themselves are creating those logics of vulnerability and insecurity. And finally, how can we think beyond frameworks of scarcity of resources or overwhelmed systems when we see that those resources exist but are put towards militarization or detention or deportation? How can we look at other ways of distributing those resources in the way that many communities are actually already doing so? We don't have to look too far for those examples of what is possible, because even in context of great need and poverty in Mexico, for example, people are responding in support of migrant populations and doing what the government is refusing to do. How organized communities are providing mutual aid, are offering sanctuary, and challenging the existing political and legal systems, showing other values, other principles, other practices that are possible and can be changed in our daily language, in our exchanges with each other, in conversations, and different frameworks that people are using around these issues.
Thank you. So I have after listening to each of you, I have a short, provocative, difficult question that I'm going to ask you for each of you, one each. I'm going to ask you to respond to briefly, and then we'll go on and see where else we go. So we'll go back and we'll do this in the same order. So Erika, the basic standard for determining who deserves protection in the United States and in Europe is the same based on the Geneva Convention of 1951, the well-founded fear of persecution, a set of ideas that emerged from the aftermath of World War II and very much in the context of the Cold War then as it was developing. Do we need an altogether new definition? Should we go back, scrap that basic principle and rewrite the fundamental notion of who deserves protection?
I'm not sure that we should scrap the current definition, but it definitely needs some additions. And there are some additions that are applied in other countries that have not been applied in the United States that I think are really important. So, for example, the Cartagena Declaration was not ratified by the United States, but was ratified by Mexico. And what that does is it gives protection to people who are fleeing just generalized violence. And so the United States doesn't do that. It results in particular for populations that have a hard time with asylum in the United States, like Central Americans fleeing gang violence or Venezuelans who are just kind of fleeing the general situation there. They're much more likely to get protection in Mexico than in the United States. And so that seems like an easy one that we could add. But I think the more pressing issue is that of climate change. We've already seen the weather patterns become very extreme, that people are being forced to migrate, and obviously formerly colonized countries are bearing the brunt of climate change when they did much fewer things to contribute to it than the destination countries. And so it seems like we see the massive climate change migration coming, and the response of the first world is building more walls, militarizing border patrol, narrowing the legal pathways for people to move, when I believe that the reaction should be the opposite, because there's nothing to say that we first world citizens won't need to move as well. And we see even now that many Americans move abroad because of cost of living, right? There is this outward migration. I think when we're talking about migration, we're just talking about this like formerly colonized countries to the first world migration, but it is going both ways. And so I think just with respect to the refugee definition, adding the Cartagena Declaration, adding something for climate change would be great. But I think just overall, it's really helpful to think from the perspective of a first world citizen and how easy it is relatively for us to migrate to other countries, for us to gain legal status. It is still a regulated process in many cases, in most cases, but it's much closer to kind of an open borders idea than what the United States is doing with respect to people seeking protection at the border. And I think really thinking beyond the refugee definition to like a broader legalization of migration is important, kind of using the example of Americans or Europeans who are able to move to, most countries in the world. Maybe you have to go through a visa process that is bureaucratic, but ultimately most are able to do so. I think that's really where we should be thinking in terms of protecting the rights of people who are migrating.
Carlos, I see you had your hand up, and Theresa next. So Carlos.
Yes, thank you. Picking up on what Erika just said, over the last couple of years, what we have witnessed is that Washington has basically moved forward with two things that are totally in opposition to the internationally accepted standard of who is an asylum seeker, who receives protection or not, and under what conditions. And those two things are that if you want to unilaterally change the definition of who is an asylum seeker and who is a refugee, then you bring a whole array of other problems into the picture. And also the imposition of a requirement that is not in the convention, which is in order to qualify for asylum or refuge into the United States, you must have been rejected by a third country. You must have applied to a different country, in this case, Mexico, and give proof that you have been rejected to that country to even qualify for the process of seeking asylum in the United States. So I'm not sure to what extent that is already law in the United States or not. But in any event, that has prompted, let's say, Cubans to say, I need a letter of rejection of Mexico. You give me that letter. and it has produced a chaotic situation when you no longer have an international accepted standard that is universal. And I do agree that you need to update it, as Erika said, but you cannot just get rid of the international covenants that must be observed by everyone.
I just want to add a couple of things. Carlos is right, and we've seen over a couple of successive administrations attempts outside of changing the statute, that our statute of the standard of asylum is based on the conventions that you mentioned. Trying to put additional limitations on that, and that has resulted in a bunch of litigation. And there's been a lot of attempt, the last administration tried, and this administration tried something slightly different, and the courts are considering that. And what that has done, ironically, is make the situation at the border more chaotic, because new policies are put in place, then a court issues an injunction, then a higher court lifts the injunction, then they consider the merits, and then it's up and it's down, and it's up and it's down. And that just encourages more kind of chaos. And for folks like Erika's organization at the border, and for the people whose job it is to implement whatever policies are in place at the moment, they don't know from day to day, what am I doing? And who does it apply to? And who doesn't it apply to? And all of this is, as the others have notably said, this sort of visceral response to what is seen as an overwhelming number of arrivals that have exceeded the capacity of our system as it exists. That having been said, to Alexandra's point, the framing around immigration is not recent. Our entire history dealing with immigration has been ambivalent over 2 centuries. No matter which groups we're talking about, every new group of arrivals, the way they arrive, is generally met in the United States with concerns about how many, too many, where are they coming? Are they bringing things that we don't want? Are they changing us too fundamentally? And it is just too easy for our politicians to demagogue that and to use that fear-based narrative. And it works. The reason they keep doing it is because it works. And we're in another one of those cyclical cycles where, instead of addressing the policy needs and thinking about it holistically, people are like, we just need to find a way to bring the numbers down or shut down the border, as if this is not a complex phenomena with 100 different causes and myriad different reasons why it's happening the way it's happening, and alternatives that we can do. So in this moment, the changing of the entire narrative around immigration is difficult. I would settle for changing the narrative from, we can just fix the border if we do just this, from, this is a complicated situation that hasn't started overnight. It's been building for at least a decade, if not longer. It has many causes and will need a complicated set of systemic solutions that should not start or end at our border. Yes, we need to think about how we process arriving migrants. Our capacity is limited. Our infrastructure is limited. We need to look at all of that. But we also need to figure out, how do we work with the transit countries and other countries that are also receiving migrants. Mexico itself has had a record level of asylum applications in Mexico as well. You look at the Venezuelans, and other countries have hosted far larger numbers of Venezuelans than the United States have for many years now. We need to figure out, from a foreign policy standpoint, how do we align our interests in managing this with the other countries in the hemisphere, and then come up with a set of things that we might do together. That is going to take time. That's diplomatic efforts. It's not an easy thing for politicians in the United States to run on, but those are what's going to allow us over the longer term, and frankly, in the medium term, to manage what is happening better than we are doing right now. And so those are the things that I would try to focus on. In the short term, we need to engage in those foreign policy level engagements. We do need to expand capacity. I agree with Erika. Expand capacity for our ports of entry to manage this. We probably, I would argue that in our current political environment, and frankly, just generally, the United States is not going to put the level of resources to expanding our adjudicative capacity to keep ahead of the number of arrivals we're seeing right now, much less deal with the 3 million case backlog in our immigration courts or the million cases in our asylum system. So we do need to find some way of alternative ways for people to apply from before they get to the border, or other legal avenues or screening processes that people can access without taking the dangerous trip. Whatever we can do to reduce the number of people that feel that their only choice is to go to the border and ask for asylum. I think we're going to have to find those ways to do that, because it's not, whatever people think about reallocating United States resources. I'm not going to say the U.S. doesn't have the resources. I'm saying politically, we are not going to reallocate the resources necessary to our adjudicative system to keep ahead of where we are right now. So we need to do something, at least in the short term, that can, I hate to say it, help people find other ways than coming to the border so that we can do some changes that we need to the system.
Maybe pick up on that last theme and ask you, Carlos. So the way the European Union has addressed this now for almost, since 2016, after the first great big surge in 2015, in terms of the alternatives, has been to send a great deal of money to peripheral countries, particularly Turkey, but also Libya, also Egypt, even into sub-Saharan Africa, billions and billions of euros of resources shifted to countries that essentially, in the equivalent in the Western Hemisphere, would be to send money to Mexico and the countries of Central America and Panama and say, keep people there. Is that a feasible idea in this hemisphere?
No, it is not. First of all, because people, in principle, as the first choice, want to go to the United States. Probably after 6 attempts, then they will say in the 7th time, okay, I'm stuck in Mexico. I can't go through the border, and I'm stuck here. So I'll stay here. But there's no guarantee that pumping money into, like Mexico, that will stop people, from trying to get into the United States. And actually, what happened in remaining in Mexico was that the government of Mexico committed verbally to tend to those people that were returned, which never happened. And those people became, the victims of criminal bands, of organized crime, and they were the target of trafficking of people in the border towns. So no, I don't think that would work. What I think we should move towards is, and I'm going to try and answer a question by Alison Ball, is that after 9/11, there's not really a migration policy put in place, but what we see is the national security spectrum overriding everything else. So there's the belief that migrants are a threat to the national security of the United States. I let others decide about that. I don't think it's the case, but in any event, what I think we should move towards, at least in the case of Mexico, which is a partner in USMCA, or TMEC as we call it in Mexico, is that we should move forward with an approach that considers the economy and employment and the need for work. The United States, Canada, and Mexico have a very acute shortage of workers. Now, can that shortage of workers be satisfied? Yes, it can, but not unless we begin to move to an approach to deal with migration and asylum that starts with taking into account the need of employers, the need of many areas of economic activity that cannot be satisfied with without recurring to immigrant work.
Alexandra.
Thank you. I just want to add to that I think here, when we're trying to focus on solutions and alternatives as you've called us to, and I think one interesting development in recent years is how much the conversation has become about a regional issue in a way that we hadn't seen before, and how that might be an opportunity to think not just about the need to keep the populations south of the border of the US border, but about the possibilities for shared responsibility among different countries around different aspects of migration. And here I'm thinking, especially in Mexico and the US, that there are many examples already of how countries collaborate, not just in the type of temporary programs that were mentioned earlier, that are creating other avenues, legal pathways for migration, and recognizing the mixed causes of migration and the different reasons why people migrate. There's the part where more collaboration needs to happen in that regard. But there's another part about how to create resources and support systems for people who are in transit or in different parts of the migration process, not just in Mexico, but in Central America and in the region. And Mexico and the US have also collaborated before, for example, through the Mexican Consular Network, in building partnerships across private and public actors in order to provide education services, health services, access to labor rights, and information around services available for people. There's a very clear way in which collaborating to share those resources and working together has already functioned to support populations that have precarious status in the US. And I wonder what can be learned from that to trickle down into Mexico, into Central America, in other places, that is not just about control or legal pathways, but it's also about how to give them safe and dignified conditions wherever they are, whether it's temporary or permanently, like access to housing and access to work permits and economic opportunity. Many studies have shown that there are gaps in the labor market in the US and in Mexico and other places that can be filled by migrant workers. So more collaboration in establishing where those spaces are and how people can be routed towards these places where they can have better opportunities would create other pathways that make people safe, and that offer opportunities for well-being, and that benefit both local communities and the migrant communities. I know there's a question in the Q&A about recognizing the fears and the concerns of local populations in the US, and I would say similarly in Mexico, communities that already suffer from unemployment, whose families have already migrated, who have conditions of poverty. How do we create also a framework in which their concerns are also addressed, and that this can be seen as an opportunity for improving conditions for everyone, not just for a solution to a problem of migration?
Let me raise a question that's come up from the audience, and it's really one of the two big macro questions in an immigration policy agenda. I mean, the way I think about it is they're really the two big questions are how many people and what kinds of people. And if you can figure those two things out, the rest of it is bureaucratic. And if you can get a political consensus around those two things, everything's solved. Let's start with the how many. So it's very clear in the short term from lots of public opinion polling that there are many Americans now, maybe more than any time since perhaps the mid-1990s, who are anxious about immigration, and particularly and often the perceptions of the border and chaos there, but also just sheer numbers. Gallup has been polling on this for many years, has asked the same question over and over again, thinking now about immigrants, that is, people who come from other countries to live here in the United States. In your view, should immigration be kept at its present level, increased or decreased? The number of people calling for a decrease had declined through most of this decade, in most of the tens, and has picked up in the last couple of years, notably. Meanwhile, it's important to remember that the number of people who would like to see immigration kept at its present level is still quite substantial. And when you add to that the number of people who say they'd like to see it increased, you get to a majority. And considering that we're at fairly high levels of migration, more or less an average about 1 million added to the population a year now over like a 20-year history, there's you get a picture of a large number of a majority that seems relatively satisfied with what has been this long-term trend, but a sizable increasing group that is increasingly anxious about numbers. So how do we think about the number? And I'll add one more note to this question. Given that we have this increasing number of displacement migrants, or expecting it to increase in the future years, should we be thinking about the way we reallocate those numbers? Should we be saying, if we're taking a total of 1.5 million people a year, sort of as a net add of the population, it should be 500,000, 750,000 are dedicated to displacement migration, and you subtract that from some other category? How do we think about this big picture question?
So Roberto, if I can,
yeah, please.
Let me talk about the macro for a minute. So we're a country of over 330 million people. We admit around, on average, over the last couple of decades, about 1 million new green card holders. I mean, there are a lot more temporary immigrants, but green card holders a year. That is about 0.3% of our population. In terms of other countries in the world, that doesn't even put us in the top 5 in terms of the percentage of our population that we admit as new immigrants each year. So while, yes, 1 million sounds like a lot, in terms of like our existing population in our country, it's not that much. And so there is a sense in which a lot of people, I think, and especially looking at that Gallup poll, I've looked at the same numbers you have, and the plurality almost always is keep it the same. Now, that question doesn't tell anybody how many immigrants are admitted. It just asks, based on what you know, what do you think? And what that tells me is not that people think, oh, we have enough. It's that people in general don't like change. They don't like change. And immigrants are seen as change agents. Whether you see that change as good or bad, immigrants tend to be seen as change agents. And so I think that plurality, keep it the same, and that the salience of that question is brought up a lot, but I think it really is just about how people are resistant to change in many ways. The other thing I think we need to point out in terms of numbers, and you raise an important question. Our numbers have not changed. The legal caps that we have not changed since 1990. But if you look at population projections, we are facing an aging society. We are at what my colleague who works on Social Security calls peak 65. From now, for the next several decades, the number of people age 65 or older in our country will be the highest it has ever been. And our birth rates have been declining. So the Congressional Budget Office that has to decide what the fiscal impact of every bill introduced in Congress is, does these projections of population, and they now project that by 2040, deaths will exceed births in the United States. And without immigration, our population would start to shrink. Now, a shrinking population has huge economic consequences, and we are already seeing this in some other countries in the world. So in terms of figuring out like what's the right number of immigration, there's different ways we can think about it. But if we understand that without immigration, we face population decline, economic decline, growth, our country will not grow, then that's a different lens which we look at the numbers that we might be able to include in our country. Right now, we have about 3.8 million more job openings than we have unemployed people. So that is a big magnet for people that want to work, and that will keep drawing them. So I think the question about numbers is sometimes more about not how many over time, but when we see a large number of arrivals in a short period of time, we are seeing localities struggle with managing them and incorporating them. And some are doing better than others, let's be clear. But capacity is always an issue. Capacity of our system at the border, capacity of cities to absorb new immigrants in a short period of time. Over time, I am fully confident that even the numbers of arrivals that we have seen will be incorporated into our economy, will be incorporated into our country. But it is creating strains right now, and we have to figure out how we manage those strains. But in the long term, figuring out what our immigration system should look like, we need to be aware that we have a population issue, and immigration is right now the only way we will grow.
I just wanted to build a bit on what Theresa was saying and talk a little bit about the public opinion piece as well. So first, there are cities that are struggling with a high number of recent arrivals, but there's also cities that desperately need workers, will pay people to move there. There's industries that desperately need migrant labor in particular, like agriculture, poultry processing, just all of the industries that immigrants, are usually a higher share of immigrant workers. And speaking of policy solutions, if the federal government, instead of spending its resources on deterrence, actually created a system to match new arrivals with places that really need them, we probably would be seeing less strain in places like New York and Chicago, where large numbers of immigrants are arriving. And keeping in mind, they cannot get work authorization for usually 6 months to a year after they submit their asylum application. So that adds an additional strain and is an additional policy solution that could be implemented relatively quickly to make sure that people can integrate more rapidly into the economic system. But I wanted to touch a little bit on the public opinion polling, because it's been very disappointing to see so much misinformation put out to the public and repeated by news outlets, and even some misleading information put out by the administration itself. So just a few quick examples. So one of the questions in the Q&A asked whether the 15% asylum approval rate is true. And that is something that has been put out by both the Trump and Biden administration. And it leads the American public to believe that individuals crossing the border in seek of protection are not legitimate asylum seekers. However, that number is just the number of cases that were positively adjudicated as a part of the entire number of cases that are pending, denied, withdrawn, et cetera. When you look at the number of total applications, like all of the people who applied, what happened with their case, the number of approvals, the percentage of approvals is more around 50%. Right. And there's actually a huge variation based on location, the judge or asylum officer adjudicating the case, whether or not you have an attorney, the US's political relationship with the country of origin, that all have a bigger effect on whether or not you win the case than whether or not you actually have a legitimate claim. And so that's one piece where I think people are thinking, well, why are these people coming here if they're not actually asylum seekers? Well, at least half of them are, and probably more if you take into consideration the other factors that I mentioned. Just another question I saw in the Q&A was about rising crime. I believe in most places, crime is not rising, first of all. And second of all, there's been numerous studies showing that immigrants actually commit crimes at far lower rates than US citizens. And so kind of connecting the increase in immigration with, the crime rates, whether or not they're increasing, I do not think they are, is misinformation, right? And again, it's getting people to see immigrants as an enemy and as a threat when the facts show that they really are not. And there's also been recent numerous studies about the economic benefit of immigration, which we've talked about, a few times on this panel, but the overall economic impact of migration is positive. That is a fact that's been proven in numerous studies. And so, but that's not what we're hearing in the media, and it's not the messaging that's coming from a lot of elected officials. And so it's hard to depend on public opinion polling as the truth of the matter, considering that the American public is bombarded with misinformation almost on a daily basis about the immigrant population.
Well, we've reached the hour and barely started, as I expected. But I want to first of all thank my dear friends and colleagues on this panel for joining in the discussion, and thank you all who've been in the audience with us. The subject is not going to go away. I'm going to reflect for just a moment on something that Theresa just mentioned, the population projections. So in the latest census projections, in the lowest immigration scenario, one in which the US population starts to decline in less than 20 years, the share of the immigrant population by the end of the century is actually higher than it is now, even with minimal immigration projections. The middle immigration projection, what's the assumption of what things would keep our population at a healthy number, envision a nation that is about 20% foreign born at the end of this century, which would be twice what it was at the beginning of this century. So change will be coming one way or another. And we're going to have many more discussions like this one to sort out how best we manage it in both in social and in policy terms. But as a down payment on a future-looking conversation, I want to thank all of you who have joined us here today, starting with our panelists.